Sometimes, the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from believing you're meant to stay that way. For 20 years, Jedediah Cain had convinced himself that solitude was enough. He lived high in the Montana mountains, trapping and surviving through brutal winters in a cabin he'd built with his own hands. Then, one snowy evening, a desperate widow named Miriam Dawes appeared at his door with 2 young children and nowhere else to go. What began as simple shelter slowly became something neither expected. Through shared meals and quiet conversations, Jed realized his carefully ordered world was missing something essential. When he finally found the courage to speak his heart, his words were plain and honest. "My cabin needs a woman's touch. Your children need a father." But would a woman who'd already lost everything be willing to risk her heart again with a mountain man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1884 had painted the Montana high country in shades of gold and crimson when Jedediah Cain first heard the desperate knocking at his cabin door. He had been whittling by the fire, his weathered hands working a piece of pine into the shape of a simple cross, the same ritual that had occupied his evening hours for the past 3 winters. The wood shavings curled at his feet like tiny prayers, and the flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He had built with his own hands 20 years before. Miriam Dawes clutched her children close as she stood in the doorway, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Around her neck, hidden beneath her worn wool dress, hung her wedding ring on a thin gold chain, the only piece of jewelry she had managed to keep when the creditors came calling. She had walked it against her skin for 2 years now, unable to wear it on her finger, but unwilling to let it go entirely. The weight of it reminded her daily of Thomas, of the life they had planned together, and of how quickly everything could be taken away. Jed set down his carving and rose slowly from his chair, his joints protesting the movement. At 57, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to conserve his strength for when it truly mattered. His hair had gone mostly gray, and lines mapped the corners of his eyes like the tributaries of some ancient river system. But his hands remained steady, and his pale blue eyes still held the quiet intensity that had served him well in his years of solitude. "Please," Miriam whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that whipped through the pine boughs. "We have nowhere else to go." Behind her, 9-year-old Timothy pressed against his mother's skirts, his small fingers clutching the broken remains of a tin soldier, the last toy his father had given him before the fever took hold. The boy's dark eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, darting between his mother and the tall stranger who filled the doorway. 7-year-old Sarah had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her golden curls matted with snow, and her small body shivering despite the thick quilt wrapped around her. Jed studied the woman before him, taking in the proud set of her shoulders. Despite her obvious desperation, the way she held her children as if they were the most precious things in creation. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins during their long journey, framing a face that spoke of recent hardship but retained an underlying strength that reminded him of the mountain wildflowers that bloomed despite the harsh conditions. "Come in," he said simply, stepping aside to let them pass. "You're letting the cold in." The interior of Yet's cabin was Spartan but well-maintained. A single large room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a ladder leading up to a small loft where he slept. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires but radiating blessed warmth. Shelves lined the walls, filled with traps, tools, and the few books he had managed to accumulate over the years. A simple wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by chairs he had crafted himself during the long winter months. Miriam hesitated at the threshold, her natural caution warring with her desperate need for shelter. She had learned to be wary of men's kindness, It so often came with a price she was unwilling to pay. But the cold was seeping through her worn coat, and Sarah was growing heavier in her arms with each passing moment. "The children," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "They need warmth," Jed finished for her. "And food, I'm guessing. When did you last eat?" The question was asked without judgment, but Miriam felt her cheeks burn with shame nonetheless. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. "We had some bread." Jed nodded and moved to the fire, adding another log and stirring the coals until the flames leaped higher. The added light revealed more details of his solitary existence: the single plate and cup on the shelves, the narrow bed in the loft, the complete absence of any feminine touch or family warmth. "Set the little one down by the fire," he instructed, pulling a thick buffalo hide from a trunk and spreading it on the floor. "I've got stew on the stove. Not fancy, but it's hot and there's plenty." As Miriam settled Sarah on the makeshift bed, the child stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she spotted Jed moving about the kitchen area, and her lower lip began to tremble. "Mama?" she whispered. "It's all right, sweetheart," Miriam soothed, smoothing her daughter's hair. "This is Mr. Cain. He's being kind to us." Timothy remained pressed against the door, his suspicious gaze following Yet's every movement. The boy had appointed himself his family's protector since his father's death, a burden far too heavy for such young shoulders. His grip on the broken soldier tightened as Jed approached with a bowl of steaming stew. "You hungry, son?" Jed asked, crouching down to the boy's level. Timothy's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying his need despite his wariness. Jed smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his features in months. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, offering the bowl. "Careful now, it's hot." As the family ate, Jed busied himself preparing sleeping arrangements. He pulled quilts from his storage chest quilts his mother had made decades ago, before consumption took her and left him truly alone in the world. The sight of them spread across his floor, filling the empty spaces of his cabin with color and purpose, stirred something in his chest that he had thought long dead. "We can't stay long," Miriam said quietly as the children ate. "I don't want to impose." "Where were you headed?" Jed asked, settling into his chair with his own bowl. Miriam's hand stilled on her spoon. "West, I suppose. Oregon, maybe. I heard there might be work there. Winter's coming on fast up here," Jed observed. "Passes will be snowed in within a week or two." The implication hung in the air between them. Even if she wanted to leave, the mountains themselves would trap them here until spring. Miriam felt panic rise in her throat, but before she could voice her concerns, Timothy spoke up. "Are you a mountain man?" the boy asked, his natural curiosity finally overcoming his caution. "I suppose I am," Jed replied. "I trap mostly. Some hunting. Trade furs down in town when the weather allows." "Do you know how to fight bears?" Timothy, Miriam warned, but Jed chuckled. "I've had my share of encounters with bears," he admitted. "Mostly they want to be left alone, same as people. But I know how to handle myself if need be." For the first time since their arrival, Timothy's posture relaxed slightly. Here was something. He could understand strength that could protect them, knowledge that could keep them safe thawed as the evening wore on. The children's exhaustion finally overtook their wariness. Sarah curled up on the buffalo hide near the fire, her thumb in her mouth and her breathing deep and regular. Timothy fought sleep longer, but eventually succumbed while sitting upright against the wall, his broken soldier still clutched in his hand. Miriam and Jed sat in comfortable silence, the crackling fire providing the only sound. She found herself studying this strange man who had opened his door to them without question. There was a gentleness in the way he had spoken to her children, a careful respect in how he had avoided crowding them or demanding explanations she wasn't ready to give. "Thank you," she finally whispered, "for the kindness. We'll be gone as soon as the weather clears." Jed was quiet for a long moment, his fingers returning to the wooden cross he had been carving. "If you don't mind me asking," he said carefully, "what brought you up this way? It's not exactly a traveled road." Miriam's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where her husband's ring lay hidden beneath the fabric. "We had some trouble in town," she said. "People talking, making judgments. Sometimes it's easier to start fresh somewhere new." Jed nodded, understanding more than she had actually said. He had lived long enough to know how quickly a community could turn against a woman alone, especially one with children to feed and no husband to protect her reputation. "Wow," he said, rising to bank the fire for the night. "Winter's no time for traveling anyway. Mountain weather can turn deadly without warning. You're welcome to stay until spring if you've a mind to." The offer was made casually, as if he were discussing the weather rather than fundamentally altering the course of all their lives. Miriam stared at him, searching his weathered face for any sign of ulterior motives or hidden expectations. "I can work," she said quickly. "Cook, clean, mend clothes. I wouldn't be a burden." "I wasn't thinking about burdens," Jed replied. "I was thinking about company. It's quiet up here in the winter months." As he climbed the ladder to his loft, leaving the main room to his unexpected guests, Jed reflected on how dramatically his world had changed in the span of a single evening. For 20 years, he had convinced himself that solitude was not just preferable, but necessary. He had built his life around the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of survival, finding purpose in the simple acts of hunting, trapping, and maintaining his small corner of the wilderness. But tonight, with the soft sounds of sleeping children filling his cabin and the knowledge that a woman sat by his fire, something had shifted. The wooden cross in his hands no longer felt like a prayer for companionship. It felt like a prayer answered, though not in any way he could have imagined thought below. Miriam sat watching the flames dance in the hearth, her children safe and warm for the first time in weeks. The wedding ring against her skin felt heavier somehow, a reminder of promises made and broken, of love found and lost. She had learned not to trust too easily, not to hope too much. But there was something about Jedediah Cain that made her want to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst of their troubles might be behind them. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, sealing them into this unexpected arrangement and setting in motion a chain of events that would transform them all in ways they could never have foreseen. 3 days after Miriam and her children had arrived, the mountain delivered its verdict on any thoughts of departure. Jed woke before dawn to an ominous stillness that every experienced mountain dweller recognized, the breathless quiet that preceded a severe storm. The air felt heavy with moisture, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. By mid-morning, snow was falling so thick that the nearest pine trees disappeared into a white wall of swirling flakes. The wind began as a whisper but grew to a howl that made the cabin's heavy log walls creak and groan. This was not the gentle snow that had welcomed them. This was the kind of blizzard that could bury a man alive if he was foolish enough to venture out unprepared. Timothy pressed his face to the single window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the storm. In his small hands, he clutched the broken tin soldier that had become his constant companion, a battered remnant of happier times, when his father would march the little figure across the kitchen table while making elaborate battle sounds. One of the soldier's arms had snapped off during their long journey, and the painted uniform had worn away in places. But Timothy refused to let his mother throw it away. "Will we be stuck here long?" the boy asked, though whether he hoped the answer would be yes or no was unclear even to himself. Jed looked up from the fire he was stoking, noting the mixture of excitement and apprehension in the child's voice. "Could be days," he said honestly. "Mountain storms like this one don't follow schedules. They end when they're good and ready." From her position at the kitchen table where she was mending one of Sarah's dresses, Miriam felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. 3 days of accepting this man's hospitality had already stretched her sense of propriety to its limits. The thought of being stranded here indefinitely, dependent on his charity, with no way to contribute meaningfully to their keep, made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I should help with something," she said, setting down her sewing. "Cooking, cleaning, something to earn our keep." "You mended my shirt yesterday," Jed reminded her gently. "And that stew you made from the rabbit I brought in was the best meal I've had in years. You're hardly idle." But Miriam was already rising, her movements sharp with nervous energy. She had learned during her marriage to Thomas that the best way to ward off trouble was to stay busy, to make herself indispensable. "The floors need sweeping, and I noticed your firewood supply is running low." "In this storm?" Jed shook his head. "Wood piles 20 yards from the door, but you can't see 5 feet in this whiteout. Nobody's going anywhere until this blows over." As if to emphasize his point, the wind gusted so fiercely that the entire cabin shuddered. Sarah, who had been playing quietly with a rag doll Miriam had fashioned from scraps, looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama?" she whispered. Miriam immediately moved to comfort her daughter, but it was Jed who spoke first. "Nothing to worry about, little one," he said in the same calm tone he might use to gentle a spooked horse. "This old cabin's weathered storms worse than this. These walls are 3 feet thick in places, and the foundation goes down 4 feet into solid rock. We're as safe here as we'd be anywhere on the mountain." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty, the unshakable competence, seemed to reassure not just Sarah but Timothy as well. The boy abandoned his post at the window and approached Jed with less of his usual wariness. "Have you been in storms like this before?" Timothy asked. "More than I can count," Jed replied. "First winter I spent up here, I thought I knew what cold was. Then December came calling, and I learned the mountain had been going easy on me up till then. What did you do?" Jed smiled, recognizing the child's need for stories that proved survival was possible. "Same thing we're doing now. Kept the fire burning, ate what I had stored up, and waited for the weather to pass. Storm can't last forever, no matter how fierce it seems at the time." By the second day of the blizzard, their forced confinement had created an unexpected intimacy. With nowhere to go and nothing urgent to do, they fell into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. Jed taught Timothy how to whittle, guiding the boy's hands as he shaped a piece of kindling into a rough approximation of a horse. Miriam found herself humming while she cooked, something she hadn't done since Thomas died. Even Sarah emerged from her shell, chattering to Jed about her doll's adventures and asking him endless questions about the animals that lived in the mountains. It was on the 3rd morning that Sarah's chatter turned to coughing. At first, Miriam thought it was just the dry air from the fire, but by afternoon the cough had deepened and the child's forehead felt warm to the touch. "She's got a fever," Miriam announced, trying to keep the panic from her voice. She had lost her husband to fever, and the sound of her daughter's labored breathing brought back memories she had worked hard to bury. Jed looked up from the harness he was repairing, taking in Miriam's pale face and the way her hands shook as she felt Sarah's forehead again. "How high?" "High enough," Miriam said tersely. She began pacing the small confines of the cabin, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. "I need to get her to a doctor." "How far is it to town?" 20 miles in good weather," Jed said quietly. "Might as well be 200 in the storm." The words hit Miriam like a physical blow. She sank into the chair beside Sarah's makeshift bed, her composure finally cracking. "I can't lose her," she whispered. "I can't lose another." "You won't," Jed interrupted, his voice carrying such conviction that both Miriam and Timothy looked at him in surprise. "I've got some experience with mountain fevers. Not a doctor, but I've kept myself and others alive through worse than this." He moved to a cabinet Miriam hadn't noticed before and withdrew a collection of small bottles and pouches. "Willow bark for the fever," he explained, measuring out a careful portion. "Pine needle tea for the chest congestion. And this," he held up a jar of dark, pungent-smelling salve. "Bear grease and herbs. Works wonders on the chest when the breathing gets difficult." As Jed worked to prepare Sarah's medicine, Miriam watched his hands steady, confident, gentle. These were hands that had delivered calves in difficult births, set broken bones on injured animals, and tended his own wounds during 20 years of solitary living. Hands that knew how to heal as well as survive. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "My mother was a healer of sorts," Jed replied without looking up from his preparations. "Learned from her grandmother, who learned from the Cherokee women in these parts. Mountain medicine. It's not fancy, but it works more often than not." He knelt beside Sarah's bed and spoke to her in the same gentle tone he had used to calm her fears about the storm. "This might taste bitter, sweetheart, but it's going to help you feel better. Can you be brave for me?" Sarah nodded solemnly and accepted the medicine without complaint. As Jed applied the salve to her chest, explaining to Miriam how to continue the treatment, Timothy moved closer to watch. The boy's fear for his sister was written plainly on his young face. But something else was there too, a growing trust in this quiet man who seemed to know exactly what to do in every crisis. Through the long night that followed, they took turns watching over Sarah. When her fever spiked near midnight, it was Jed who knew to bathe her with cool water. When her coughing fits left her exhausted and frightened, it was Jed who held her until she could breathe easily again. And when Miriam finally collapsed from exhaustion near dawn, it was Jed who covered her with a quilt and kept vigil alone. By the fourth morning, Sarah's fever had broken. She woke asking for breakfast, her color normal and her breathing clear. The storm, as if it had been waiting for this moment, began to weaken. The wind died to a whisper, and patches of blue sky became visible through the thinning clouds. Miriam stood at the window, holding her daughter, watching the sun emerge from behind the retreating storm clouds. The crisis had passed, but something fundamental had shifted during those long hours of shared worry and mutual dependence. She found herself looking at Jedediah Cain with new eyes, not as a stranger who had offered temporary shelter, but as the man who had possibly saved her daughter's life. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying far more weight than their simplicity suggested. Jed nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, but understanding its necessity. "She's a strong little girl, mountain strong," as if sensing the change. In the adults around them, Timothy approached Jed with less of his usual reserve. "Could you teach me more about mountain medicine?" he asked. "In case Sarah gets sick again?" The question touched something deep in Jed's chest. The boy's desire to protect his family, his willingness to learn, his growing acceptance of Jed as someone worth listening to. It was, Jed realized, the first time in 20 years that anyone had looked to him not just for survival, but for knowledge worth passing on. "I'd be honored to," he replied, and meant it more than he had meant anything in years. In the days following Sarah's recovery, life in the cabin settled into rhythms that none of them had expected to find so comfortable. Jed woke before dawn, as he always had, but now instead of dressing in silence and solitude, he moved quietly, so as not to wake the family sleeping below. The sight of them Miriam curled under his mother's quilts, the children nestled close to her warmth, had become something he looked forward to each morning, a reminder that his world had expanded beyond the simple needs of survival. Miriam rose with the sun, her movements automatic from years of tending to household duties. But here, in Jed's domain, she found herself having to learn new rhythms. The wood-burning stove required different timing than the coal stove she had used in town. The well was farther from the kitchen than she was accustomed to. Even simple tasks like hanging laundry required adaptation to the mountain wind and the unpredictable weather. But it was while exploring the cabin's storage areas that she discovered something that stopped her in her tracks. Tucked away in a corner of the loft, covered by an old tarp, sat an unfinished rocking chair. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the curved runners perfectly shaped, the back spindles turned with obvious skill and care. But the seat remained unfinished, and the arms were only roughly shaped, as if the maker had simply stopped mid-project and walked away. "I found something upstairs," she said to Jed when he returned from checking his trap lines that afternoon. Jed followed her gaze to where she stood near the ladder, and his expression grew carefully neutral. "Ah, that. It's beautiful work," Miriam said carefully. "Were you making it for someone?" Jed's hands stilled on the trap he was cleaning. The rocking chair represented dreams he had abandoned so long ago that he had almost forgotten they existed. He had started it during his third winter on the mountain, back when he still believed that loneliness was temporary, that someone might come along to share his carefully built life. "Started it years ago," he said finally. "Never seemed to find the time to finish it." But Miriam had raised children, had been married to a man who worked with his hands, and she recognized the careful attention to detail that spoke of deep personal meaning. This wasn't a project abandoned for lack of time. This was a dream set aside because the dreamer had given up hope. "Would you mind if I helped?" she asked softly. "I'm not much with woodworking, but I can sand or hold pieces while you work." Jed looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for pity or false sympathy. Instead, he found only genuine interest and a kind of quiet understanding that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Might be nice to have another pair of hands," he admitted. That evening, after the children were settled by the fire with their lessons, Miriam had been teaching them from the few books Jed owned. She and Jed brought the rocking chair down from the loft. In the better light, Miriam could see the intricate details he had carved into the headrest, a pattern of pine boughs and mountain wildflowers that spoke of countless hours of patient work. "Thomas would have admired this," she said without thinking, then immediately stiffened, realizing she had spoken her late husband's name aloud for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Jed's hands paused in their examination of the chairs. "Joints. He was a craftsman?" "A carpenter," Miriam replied carefully. "He built most of our furniture." Said there was something honest about working with wood. It didn't lie to you the way people sometimes did. It was the most she had revealed about her past, and Jed sensed the trust implicit in the sharing. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Miriam's fingers traced the carved flowers on the headrest. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said you could judge a man's character by the care he put into work that no one else would see." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy, but meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge directly. Instead, Jed reached for his sandpaper and began working on the chair's arm, the rhythmic motion soothing in its familiarity. As the days passed, their evening work sessions became a ritual. Timothy often joined them, eager to learn and surprisingly apt with the smaller tools. Sarah would curl up nearby with her rag doll, chattering about her day or making up elaborate stories about the mountain animals Jed had taught her to identify. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Jed began to share pieces of his own history. Not the dramatic events that had brought him to the mountain, but the smaller memories that revealed the man he had been before solitude shaped him. "Had a dog once," he mentioned while showing Timothy how to properly hold a chisel. "Border collie, named Rex. Smartest animal I ever knew. Could predict weather changes 3 days out, and he never met a problem he couldn't think his way around." "What happened to him?" Timothy asked, his young face serious with interest. "Old age, mostly. Lived a good long life for a mountain dog. Buried him up on the ridge where he liked to sit and watch the valley." Jed's voice carried no self-pity, just a matter-of-fact acceptance of loss that came with mountain living. Haven't had the heart to get another one since. Miriam looked up from the spindle she was sanding, recognizing something in Yet's tone that spoke of deeper isolation than just a physical distance from town. Animals make good companions, she said. Sometimes better than people. Rex was better company than most folks I've known, Jed agreed. Present company accepted, of course. The small joke was delivered so dryly that it took Miriam a moment to realize it was a joke at all. When she did, her laugh was genuine and surprised. The first truly carefree sound she had made since arriving at the cabin. Timothy looked between. The adults, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand, but recognizing that something important was happening. His grip on the broken tin soldier in his pocket loosened slightly for the first time in months. He felt less like he had to stand guard against the world dawn as October deepened into November. The routines they had established began to feel less like temporary arrangements and more like the natural order of things. Jed found himself planning his trap lines with the family's needs in mind, choosing routes that would bring him home in time for the evening meal. Miriam discovered herself humming while she worked, her movements around the cabin growing more confident as she learned its quirks and rhythms. The children, meanwhile, were thriving in ways that surprised their mother. Timothy's suspicious wariness had given way to genuine curiosity about mountain life, and he followed Jed around like an eager apprentice whenever chores allowed. Sarah had begun treating Jed as she might a favorite uncle, chattering to him about her thoughts and dreams with the unself-conscious trust that only children possessed. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way Miriam found herself watching Jed when she thought he wasn't looking. She noticed the gentleness in his weathered hands when he helped Sarah with her buttons, the patience in his voice when Timothy asked the same question for the third time, the way he always made sure the heaviest work was done before she could attempt it herself. These weren't the calculated gestures of a man with ulterior motives, she realized. They were the instinctive actions of someone who had been alone so long that the simple opportunity to care for others had awakened something he had thought lost forever. One evening, as they worked together on the rocking chair's final details, Miriam made a discovery that brought all these observations into sharp focus. While adjusting her position to better reach a difficult corner, her hand brushed against Yet's arm. Instead of pulling away immediately, she found herself noticing the solid warmth of him, the way his presence had come to represent safety and stability in a world that had offered her precious little of either. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She had convinced herself that her capacity for such feelings had died with Thomas, that the practical affection she felt for Jed was simply gratitude dressed up in more appealing clothes. But the flutter in her chest when their eyes met across the table, the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at something Sarah said, these were not the responses of a woman motivated solely by practical concerns. For his part, Jed was struggling with his own unexpected feelings. 20 years of solitude had taught him to be suspicious of his own needs, to question any desire that might lead to disappointment. But watching Miriam move through his cabin, seeing his stock bachelor's quarters transformed by her presence and the children's laughter, he found himself imagining a future he had never dared to consider. The rocking chair, nearly finished now, stood as a testament to possibilities neither of them had quite found the courage to voice. Soon, they both knew, decisions would have to be made about the future, about whether this arrangement was truly temporary or something that might, with care and courage, become permanent. As November settled over the mountains with its promise of harder weather to come, Miriam found herself spending more time in the kitchen area of the cabin, not just preparing meals, but experimenting with the preserved foods Jed had stored for winter. Among her possessions, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and carried despite the extra weight, was her most treasured possession, a leather-bound recipe book filled with her mother's handwriting. The pages were yellowed with age and use. some spotted with flour and egg stains, that told the story of countless meals prepared with love. Each recipe was written in her mother's careful script, accompanied by notes and modifications developed over years of feeding a growing family. Add extra molasses in winter months, read one notation. Children prefer these with raisins, said another. This was my mother's, Miriam explained to Jed one evening as she consulted the book while preparing supper. And her mother's before that. Some of these recipes go back 50 years or more. Jed looked up from where he was teaching Timothy to repair a leather harness, his hands guiding the boy's fingers as they worked the needle through the tough material. Family knowledge is precious, he said. Not many things survive the way recipes do. Mama always said cooking was love made visible, Miriam continued, her voice soft with memory. That every meal was a chance to show your family how much they meant to you. As November settled over the mountains with its promise of harder weather to come, Miriam found herself spending more time in the kitchen area of the cabin, not just preparing meals, but experimenting with the preserved foods Jed had stored for winter. Among her possessions, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth and carried despite the extra weight, was her most treasured possession, a leather-bound recipe book filled with her mother's handwriting. The pages were yellowed with age and use, some spotted with flour and egg stains that told the story of countless meals prepared with love. Each recipe was written in her mother's careful script, accompanied by notes and modifications developed over years of feeding a growing family. Add extra molasses. In winter months, read one notation. Children prefer these with raisins, said another. This was my mother's, Miriam explained to Jed one evening as she consulted the book while preparing supper. And her mother's before that. Some of these recipes go back 50 years or more. Jed looked up from where he was teaching Timothy to repair a leather harness, his hands guiding the boy's fingers as they worked the needle through the tough material. Family knowledge is precious, he said. Not many things survive the way recipes do. Mama always said cooking was love made visible, Miriam continued, her voice soft with memory. That every meal was a chance to show your family how much they meant to you. As if summoned by the mention of love and family, Sarah appeared at Miriam's elbow, standing on her tiptoes to peer into the mixing bowl. What are you making, Mama? Something special, Miriam replied, consulting the recipe book again. Grandmother Dawes molasses cookies. I haven't made them since. She paused, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air. Since Thomas died. Since their world fell apart. Since she stopped believing there was anything worth celebrating. But here, in this warm cabin, with the fire crackling and the gentle sounds of Yet's patient instruction filling the air, those memories felt less like wounds and more like treasures to be shared. Can I help? Sarah asked, her small face bright with eagerness. Of course you can. Miriam lifted her daughter onto a wooden crate so she could reach the counter. You can be my official taster. Very important job. From across the room, Jed watched this domestic scene with an ache in his chest that was equal parts longing and contentment. The cabin that had seemed perfectly adequate for his solitary needs now felt alive in ways he hadn't known were possible. The sounds of family life, Sarah's chatter, Timothy's questions, Miriam's humming-filled spaces that silence had occupied for too long. Mr. Jed, Timothy said, pausing in his work with the harness, why did you come to live on the mountain? It was a question Jed had been expecting, though he hadn't been sure how he would answer it when it came. The boy deserved honesty, but there were depths to that story that a 9-year-old didn't need to carry. I was looking for peace, I suppose, he said carefully. Sometimes a man needs to get away from the noise of the world to figure out who he really is. Did you find out? Timothy asked with the directness that only children possessed. Jed considered the question seriously. 20 years ago, he had come to this mountain running from grief and guilt, convinced that isolation was the price he owed for his failures. He had built his life around the idea that he was better off alone, that the risk of caring and losing again was too great to bear. But now, watching Miriam teach her daughter the same lessons her own mother had taught her, seeing Timothy's face light up with pride when he successfully completed a stitch, feeling the warmth of belonging that came from being needed and valued. Now he wasn't sure that the man who had fled to this mountain was the same man who inhabited this cabin. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted Dot as the evening progressed. The cabin filled with the rich scent of molasses and spices. Miriam moved through Yet's kitchen with increasing confidence, adapting her family recipes to the ingredients and equipment available. She found herself making small changes to accommodate Yet's preferences: less salt in the bread because he mentioned he didn't care for it, more herbs in the stew because she had noticed how much he enjoyed the wild seasonings he gathered from the mountainside. These adjustments felt natural, even intimate, like learning to dance with a new partner by paying attention to their rhythm and style. It occurred to her that she was creating new memories to layer over the old ones, new traditions that honored the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. "Jed," she said while waiting for the cookies to bake, "would you tell us about your first winter on the mountain?" Timothy loves adventure stories, and I confess I'm curious myself about how you managed alone. Jed settled back in his chair. Sarah perched on his lap with the unconscious trust she had developed over the past weeks. Timothy moved closer, his broken tin soldier momentarily forgotten as he prepared to listen. "Well," Jed began, "I thought I was prepared. Had enough food stored, plenty of firewood cut, warm clothes, and good boots. What I didn't count on was how quiet it would be." "Quiet's good," Sarah piped up. "Mama always says quiet time helps us think." "Your mama's right," Jed agreed. "But mountain quiet is different. It's so complete that you start to hear things you never noticed before: your own heartbeat, the sound of your breathing. Even your thoughts seem louder somehow." As he spoke, weaving a story that was equal parts adventure and reflection, Miriam found herself studying his face in the firelight. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting in the sun and snow, a careful way of moving that suggested old injuries healed but not forgotten. But there was also a gentleness in his expression when he looked at her children, a warmth in his voice when he spoke to her, that suggested the capacity for deep feeling lay just beneath his reserved surface. When the cookies were done, they shared them while still warm, the sweetness of molasses and the bite of ginger, creating flavors that seemed to capture the essence of home and comfort. Sarah declared them the best cookies in the whole world, while Timothy ate 3 before announcing that he was saving room for more. "They're very good," Jed said quietly to Miriam. "Your mother would be proud." The simple compliment brought unexpected tears to Miriam's eyes. She had been cooking for survival for so long that she had almost forgotten the joy of preparing food for people who appreciated not just the nourishment but the care that went into its creation. Later, after the children were asleep and the last of the evening chores were finished, Miriam and Jed sat by the fire with the comfortable silence that had become natural between them. The recipe book lay open on the table between them, its pages a bridge between her past and their uncertain future. "I used to dream about teaching these recipes to a daughter-in-law someday," Miriam said softly, "imagining grandchildren learning the same traditions I learned at my mother's elbow." "Those dreams don't have to stay dreams," Jed replied carefully. "Sarah's already learning, and Timothy too, in his way." It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging that this arrangement might be more than temporary, that the feelings growing between them might be something worth nurturing rather than simply enduring, until spring made other options possible. "Jed," Miriam began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that had been building in her heart. Questions about the future, about the possibility of love after loss, about whether a practical woman with 2 children had any right to hope for more than simple survival. "I know," he said gently, as if he could read her thoughts. "I've been wondering about the same things." Outside, the first serious snow of the season began to fall, each flake a small promise that winter was settling in for good, that decisions made now would have to sustain them through the long months ahead. But inside the cabin, with the fire, warm and the taste of molasses cookies still sweet on their tongues, the future felt less frightening than it had in a very long time. The first week of December brought with it a visitor that none of them had expected. Jed was outside splitting firewood when he heard the jingle of harness bells echoing off the canyon walls. A sound that meant civilization was approaching there. Mountain sanctuary. He set down his axe and shaded his eyes against the winter sun, watching as a horse and rider picked their way up the treacherous trail that led to his cabin. The visitor turned out to be Charlie Morrison, the postmaster from Bear Creek, a weathered man in his 60s who made irregular trips to the outlying homesteads when the weather allowed. Charlie's arrival was always welcome for the news and mail he brought, but today his expression was unusually grave as he dismounted from his sturdy mountain pony. "Jed," Charlie said, accepting the cup of coffee Miriam offered with a nod of thanks. "Good to see you're doing well. And these must be the folks I've been hearing about in town." The words sent a chill through Miriam that had nothing to do with the December air. "Hearing about us." Charlie's weathered face was kind but serious. "Mrs. Dawes, I'm afraid there's been some talk. Judge Harrison sent me up here specifically to check on your situation. Seems someone's been asking questions about you and the children." Timothy moved closer to his mother, his hand instinctively going to the broken tin soldier in his pocket. Sarah, sensing the tension in the adults around her, stopped playing with her doll and looked between her mother and the stranger with wide, worried eyes. "What kind of questions?" Jed asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Legal questions," Charlie replied. "About proper guardianship, about whether it's fitting for a woman with children to be living with an unmarried man so far from town." The person asking seemed to think the children might be better off in a more structured environment. Miriam felt the blood drain from her face. She had hoped that their distance from Bear Creek would protect them from the gossip and judgment that had driven them from their previous home. But apparently, even 20 miles of mountain wilderness wasn't far enough to escape the reach of those who believed they knew what was best for other people's children. "Who's been asking?" She managed to say, "Mrs. Evangeline Hartwell," Charlie said with obvious reluctance. "She's got some kind of connection to your late husband's family, I believe. Says she's concerned about the children's moral upbringing." The name hit Miriam like a physical blow. Evangeline Hartwell was Thomas's sister-in-law, a woman who had made no secret of her disapproval of their marriage and her belief that Thomas had married beneath his station. After Thomas's death, she had offered to take the children, not out of love. Miriam knew, but out of a sense of duty that would have seen Timothy and Sarah raised as charity cases in a household where they would never truly belong. "She wants the children," Miriam whispered. "Now, don't go borrowing trouble," Charlie said quickly. "Judge Harrison's a fair man, and he's not inclined to break up families without good cause. But he did ask me to assess the situation and report back. Make sure the children are being properly cared for and educated." Yet's jaw tightened as he looked around the cabin at the warm fire, the well-stocked shelves, the children's obvious health and happiness. "Do we look like we're not taking proper care of them?" "You look like a family," Charlie said simply. "But the law doesn't always see things the way regular folks do. The fact is, Mrs. Dawes, you're an unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. That's the kind of arrangement that makes people talk, especially people like Mrs. Hartwell who have strong opinions about proper behavior." The words hung heavy in the air, spelling out the impossible situation they found themselves in. The very thing that had saved them, Yet's offer of shelter and protection, was now being used against them as evidence of impropriety. "What can we do?" Miriam asked, though she already feared she knew the answer. "Well," Charlie said carefully, "there are really only two options that would satisfy the law and the busybodies both. Either Mrs. Dawes finds more conventional living arrangements, or—" He paused, glancing between Jed and Miriam with the delicate expression of a man approaching sensitive territory. "Or," Jed prompted. "Or you get married," Charlie finished. "Legal marriage would make this a respectable household in the eyes of the law. Can't argue with the propriety of a man providing for his own family." The suggestion settled over them, like a blanket of snow covering everything, changing the landscape, making it impossible to see the familiar world they had been navigating just moments before. Marriage. The word carried weight that went far beyond legal convenience, implications that none of them had dared to speak aloud. Timothy broke the silence that followed. "What happens if we have to leave?" he asked, his young voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Charlie looked at the boy with genuine sympathy. "Judge Harrison would likely place you with relatives who could provide proper supervision. Mrs. Hartwell has already expressed her willingness to take responsibility for your upbringing." "No," Sarah said suddenly, her small voice fierce with determination. "I don't want to go with a mean lady. I want to stay here with Mr. Jed." Her simple declaration cut through the legal complexities and social conventions to the heart of the matter. This was home. This was family. The fact that it didn't fit conventional definitions seemed suddenly irrelevant compared to the love and security they had found in this remote cabin. "How long do we have?" Miriam asked. "Judge wants a report by the end of the month," Charlie replied. "But Mrs. Hartwell's making noise about coming up here herself if she doesn't get satisfaction soon. Claims she's worried about the children being exposed to improper influences." After Charlie left, promising to delay his report as long as possible, the cabin felt different. The warm sanctuary they had created was now revealed to be vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The outside world, which had seemed safely distant, was reaching in to threaten the fragile happiness they had built. That evening, long after the children were asleep, Jed and Miriam sat by the fire in silence. The practical reality of their situation lay between them like a challenge that demanded an answer. Marriage would solve the legal problem, would give them the protection they needed to stay together. But marriage also meant crossing a line they had both been carefully avoiding, acknowledging feelings that neither felt quite ready to examine. "I won't let them take the children," Jed said finally. "It's not your fight," Miriam replied, though the words came out more bitter than she intended. "You didn't ask for this complication." "Maybe not," Jed agreed. "But complications have a way of becoming part of life whether we ask for them or not. And those children, they belong here. This is where they're happy and safe." "Marriage is a serious thing," Miriam said quietly. "It shouldn't be entered into just to satisfy legal requirements." "No," Jed agreed. "It shouldn't." They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, a snowy owl called from somewhere in the darkness, the same bird whose feather the children had found during one of their walks, a symbol of the rare beauty that had entered their harsh mountain world. But tonight, even that beauty felt fragile, threatened by forces they could neither predict nor control. 3 days after Charlie Morrison's visit, Jed made a decision that surprised even himself. While Miriam was busy with the children's morning lessons, he climbed up to the loft and retrieved something he hadn't touched in 20 years, his father's trapping journal, a leather-bound book that contained not just records of trap lines and weather patterns, but the accumulated wisdom of a man who had understood that survival in the wilderness required more than just practical skills. The journal was worn smooth by handling, its pages filled with his father's careful handwriting. Marcus Cain had been a man of few words in life, but on paper He had been eloquent about the things that mattered: respect for the land, the importance of preparation, and above all, the understanding that a man's true wealth was measured not in gold or property, but in the people who depended on him and the legacy he left behind. A man who won't fight for what he loves? Read one entry that Jed had memorized years ago. Ain't much of a man at all. But fighting don't always mean violence. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need something you've been afraid to want. Jed had been 15 when his father wrote those words, too young to understand their full meaning. Now, at 57, with the weight of potential loss pressing down on him, they felt like a message sent across the years specifically for this moment. That afternoon, while Miriam was outside hanging laundry and the children were napping, Jed sat down at his kitchen table with a piece of paper and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as he found the courage to put his feelings into language that had been bottled up inside him for months. When Miriam came back inside, her cheeks pink from the cold air, she found him, still bent over the paper, his weathered hands moving the pen with surprising delicacy. "What are you working on?" she asked, hanging her shawl on the peg by the door. Jed looked up, his pale blue eyes serious but determined. "A letter to Judge Harrison, about our situation." Miriam felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. What kind of letter? Instead of answering directly, Jed stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered meadow where Timothy and Sarah had spent so many happy hours exploring and playing. "Miriam," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know. I'm asking because I want us to, not because we're being forced into it." She moved to stand beside him at the window, her heart beating faster at the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" Jed turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I know this isn't the way either of us planned for things to happen. I know you love Thomas, and I respect that. I know you're not looking for a replacement for him, and I'm not presuming to try to be one." "Jed, let me finish," he said gently. "Please, I've been thinking about this for days, and I need to say it all before I lose my nerve." Miriam nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've lived alone for 20 years, Jed continued. Convinced myself I was content with my own company, that I didn't need anything more than what I built here. But these past months with you and the children, they've shown me that I was just existing, not really living." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know if what I feel for you is the same kind of love you had with Thomas. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's something different, quieter, built on respect and shared daily life instead of passion and promises. But it's real, Miriam, and it's strong enough to build a life on." Miriam felt tears prick her eyes, but she remained silent, sensing that he wasn't finished. "The children, Timothy and Sarah, they're not my blood, but they feel like mine. When Timothy asks me questions about trapping, or when Sarah falls asleep in my lap by the fire, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. They need a father, and God help me, I need to be their father." Jed reached out and took her hands in his calloused fingers warm and steady. "I'm asking you to marry me, Miriam. Not because the law says we have to, but because I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life knowing that you and the children are truly mine to protect and provide for. I want the right to call myself their father and your husband." For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. Miriam looked into Yet's face, searching for any sign of duty or obligation rather than genuine feeling. Instead, she found only honesty and a hope so carefully controlled that it made her heart ache. "I can't promise to love you the way I loved Thomas," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking you to," Jed replied. "I'm asking you to let me love you the way you deserve to be loved now in this life we're building together. Whatever that looks like, however long it takes to grow into something neither of us can imagine yet." Miriam thought about the months they had spent together, the gradual way her heart had begun to heal in the warmth of his steady presence. She thought about the way he had saved Sarah's life without expecting thanks, the patience he showed Timothy when teaching him new skills, the careful respect he had shown her even as their feelings for each other deepened. She thought about the alternative being separated from the man who had become not just their protector but their anchor. Watching her children be taken away to live with people who would see them as obligations rather than gifts. The choice, when viewed that way, was no choice at all. "Yes," she said simply. Yet's face lit up with a smile so genuine and relieved that it transformed his usually serious features completely. "Yes, yes," Miriam repeated, her own smile beginning to bloom despite the tears that were now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jedediah Cain, because you're right, this is real, and it's strong, and it's worth fighting for." When Timothy and Sarah woke from their nap to find the adults holding hands by the window, their faces glowing with something that looked very much like happiness, they didn't need explanations to understand that their world had just become more secure, more permanent, more truly home than it had ever been before. That evening, Jed finished his letter to Judge Harrison with very different words than he had originally planned. Instead of a defensive explanation of their living arrangements, he wrote a simple notification of their engagement and upcoming marriage, along with an invitation for the judge to visit their home and see for himself the family they had become. The letter was signed not just by Jed, but by Miriam as well, and at the bottom, in carefully practiced letters, Timothy had added his own signature as the man of the family, giving his approval to the match. The letter arrived on a bitter cold morning 2 weeks before Christmas, carried up the mountain by a deputy sheriff whose grim expression warned of trouble before he even dismounted from his horse. Jed accepted the official envelope with steady hands, though something in his gut told him that their carefully planned future was about to be thrown into chaos. The document inside was more than just a legal notice. It was a formal petition for custody filed by Evangeline Hartwell, complete with sworn affidavits and a court order, requiring the immediate removal of Timothy and Sarah Dawes from what the papers described as an immoral and unsuitable living situation. But it was the second document that hit like a physical blow. Attached to the custody petition was a copy of a will, Thomas Dawes's will, that Miriam had never seen before. According to the legal papers, Thomas had made provisions not just for his wife and children, but had specifically named his brother Samuel Hartwell as guardian of his children in the event that both parents should die or, as the document stated, should circumstances arise that render the mother unable to provide proper moral guidance. "I don't understand," Miriam whispered, the papers shaking in her hands. "Thomas never mentioned a will. We talked about what would happen to the children if something happened to us, and he never said anything about Samuel." Jed read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he took in the implications. "According to this, your husband made this will just 6 months before he died. Did he seem troubled about anything during that time? Worried about something he wasn't telling you?" Miriam's mind raced back to those final months of Thomas's life. He had been different, more thoughtful, more likely to spend long hours staring out the window instead of working. She had attributed it to the lung condition that would eventually kill him. But now she wondered if there had been more to his preoccupation. "He was sick," she said slowly, "but there were times when he seemed to be wrestling with something. He would start to tell me things, then stop himself. I thought it was just a fever making him restless." The deputy sheriff, a young man named Collins, who clearly uncomfortable with his errand, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but Judge Harrison has reviewed the petition and the supporting documents. Given the existence of the will and the irregular nature of your current living arrangements, he's ordered that the children be placed in temporary custody with Mrs. Hartwell while the court determines what's in their best interests." No, Timothy said from the doorway, where he had been listening with Sarah pressed close against his side. The boy's face was pale but determined as he stepped forward, his broken tin soldier clutched tightly in his hand. We're not going with her. This is our home. Mr. Jed is going to be our papa. Deputy Collins looked uncomfortable as he glanced between the children and the adults. Son, I understand this is difficult, but the law is the law. The court has determined that it's best for you and your sister to stay with family while things get sorted out. She's not family, Sarah said suddenly, her small voice fierce with indignation. She's the mean lady who said Mama was too poor to take care of us. Mr. Jed takes better care of us than anyone ever has. The deputy's expression softened as he looked at the children, but his voice remained firm. I'm sorry, but I have my orders. You need to gather your things. Mrs. Hartwell is waiting in town with proper transportation. It was then that Jed stepped forward, his tall frame filling the doorway as he faced the deputy with quiet authority. What exactly does this court order say? Are you authorized to remove the children immediately, or is there a grace period for the family to respond? Collins consulted the papers again, clearly hoping to find some wiggle room that would spare him from having to drag two children away from the only home they had known in months. Wow, the order says they need to be in Mrs. Hartwell's custody by Christmas Eve. That gives you 8 days. 8 days to do what? Miriam asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. To challenge the will, if you think there's grounds, the deputy replied. Or to demonstrate to the court that the children's current situation is in their best interests despite the irregularities. After the deputy left, the cabin felt like a battlefield where they had just learned they were hopelessly outgunned. The legal documents lay spread across the kitchen table like instruments of warfare, each paragraph a weapon designed to tear their family apart. There has to be something wrong with this will, Miriam said, pacing the small confines of the cabin. Thomas wouldn't have made these arrangements without telling me. And Samuel, he barely knew the children. He visited maybe twice in their whole lives. Jed studied the documents with the careful attention he usually reserved for tracking difficult game. The signatures look authentic, he said reluctantly, and the witness signatures are notarized. If this is a forgery, it's a very good one. What if it's not a forgery? Miriam asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. What if Thomas really did make these arrangements? What if he didn't trust me to take care of our children? The anguish in her voice made Jed look up sharply. That's not possible. I've seen you with Timothy and Sarah. Any man would be proud to have you raising his children. But what if the illness affected his thinking? What if he was influenced by his family's opinions about me? They never thought I was good enough for him. Never believed I could provide the kind of life they thought the children deserved. Timothy, who had been silent since the deputy's departure, suddenly spoke up. I remember when Papa made us go visit Uncle Samuel that last time. He was acting strange, like he was sad about something. And Uncle Samuel kept asking him questions about money and about what would happen to us if Papa got sicker. Miriam stared at her son, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. When was this, Timothy? Do you remember? It was after Papa started coughing blood, Timothy said. Maybe 2 months before he died. Uncle Samuel kept saying things about how we needed stability and proper education, and how it wasn't fair to burden you with everything if Papa couldn't work anymore. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking in its clarity. Thomas, facing his own mortality and worried about his family's future, had been convinced by his brother that providing for his children's security meant ensuring they would have guardians with more resources than his struggling wife could offer. It was an act of love born from fear, but one that now threatened to destroy everything Miriam had built in the aftermath of his death. He was trying to protect us, Miriam whispered. He thought he was doing the right thing. Maybe he was, given what he knew at the time, Jed said gently. But he couldn't have known about this. He gestured around the cabin, encompassing not just the physical space but the life they had created within its walls. He couldn't have known that his children would find another father who would love them as his own. That evening, as they sat around the fire trying to pretend that nothing had changed, Sarah climbed onto Yet's lap and looked up at him with serious eyes. "Mr. Jed," she said, "are they really going to take us away?" Yet's arms tightened around a small frame as he met Miriam's gaze over the child's head. "Not if I have anything to say about it, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes it takes a while to fix them. But I promise you this, I will fight with everything. I have to keep our family together." It was a promise made in desperation and sealed with determination, but as the wind howled around the cabin that night, carrying with it the threat of separation and loss, none of them could know whether love and determination would be enough to overcome the cold machinery of law and obligation that now threatened to tear them apart. In the days following the deputy's visit, Jed threw himself into preparations with the same methodical intensity he had once brought to surviving his first mountain winter. But instead of stockpiling firewood and preserved food, he was gathering evidence, testimonies, and legal arguments that might convince a judge that love could triumph over law. The first order of business was the ring. On the third day after receiving the court papers, Jed climbed down from the loft carrying a small wooden box that had remained untouched for 20 years. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft leather, was a ring he had carved himself from a nugget of mountain silver, simple, unadorned, but crafted with painstaking care during the long winter evenings of his second year on the mountain. He had made it for a woman he had loved once, back when he still believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. She had chosen a different path, a safer man, a more conventional life, leaving Jed to learn that sometimes the deepest cuts came not from enemies, but from those whose happiness mattered more than your own pain. "I want you to have this," he said to Miriam, offering the ring with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. "It's not much to look at, but it's real silver, and it's made to last." Miriam looked at the ring, then at Yet's face, seeing layers of story in his expression that she knew he would never fully share. "Are you certain? This looks like something with history behind it." "It does have history," Jed admitted, "but not the kind that should keep it from having a future. I made this ring for love, and that's still what it's for. Just different love than I expected back then." As Miriam slipped the ring onto her finger, finding that it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 20 years for this exact moment, she felt the weight of commitment settle around her heart. This wasn't the desperate arrangement of two people backed into a corner by circumstances. This was a choice, made freely and with full understanding of the risks involved. The next challenge was gathering support for their case. Jed saddled his horse and rode down to Bear Creek, spending 3 days visiting every person who had ever had dealings with Miriam and the children. He spoke to Mrs. Henderson at the general store, who remembered Miriam's unfailing courtesy and the children's good behavior during their brief time in town. He tracked down Dr. Milliken, who had treated Sarah during a bout of measles the previous year, and could testify to the family's obvious devotion to each other. Most importantly, he found Charlie Morrison, who agreed not only to testify about the stable, loving home he had witnessed during his visit to the cabin, but also to help investigate the circumstances surrounding Thomas Dawes' will. "There's something that's been bothering me about this whole business," Charlie confided as they sat in the back room of the post office, reviewing the legal documents by lamplight. "Samuel Hartwell isn't exactly known for his charitable nature. Man's tighter with $1 than bark on a tree. Why would he suddenly want to take on the expense of raising 2 children? It was a question that led to some uncomfortable discoveries. Through careful inquiry and the kind of patient, detective work that came naturally to men who had spent their lives reading tracts and signs, they learned that Samuel Hartwell had recently invested heavily in a mining venture that had gone bad. He was facing significant financial difficulties. Difficulties that might be alleviated by gaining control of any inheritance the children might have coming to them. Thomas had a small life insurance policy, Miriam revealed when they shared this information with her. Nothing substantial, but enough to see the children through school if it was managed carefully. He also owned a small piece of property in Oregon that his father left him. I never thought much about it because it seemed so far away and we had no plans to move there. The picture that emerged was increasingly disturbing. Thomas, in his weakened state and influenced by his brother's arguments about providing security for his family, had unknowingly signed documents that would give Samuel control not just of the children, but of their modest inheritance as well. Armed with this information, Jed made another trip to town, this time to meet with Judge Harrison directly. The judge was a fair man, but one who believed deeply in the sanctity of legal documents and the importance of following proper procedures. He listened to Yet's arguments with patience, but little apparent sympathy. "Mr. Cain," the judge said when Jed had finished presenting his case, "I understand your attachment to these children, and from all accounts, you've provided them with excellent care. But the law exists to protect children from situations where emotion might override their best interests. A properly executed will, witnessed and notarized, represents the considered judgment of their father about what would be best for them. What if that judgment was influenced by false information?" Jed pressed. What if Thomas Dawes was led to believe that his wife couldn't provide for the children when in fact she's proven herself more than capable? That would be a matter for the courts to determine through proper proceedings, Judge Harrison replied. In the meantime, the children's welfare requires that they be placed in the custody specified by their father's will. It was a frustrating but expected response. Legal systems moved slowly and cautiously, while their deadline moved inexorably closer. Christmas Eve was only 4 days away, and they had exhausted their formal legal options. But Jed had learned during his 20 years on the mountain that there was more than one way to solve a problem. That evening, he sat down with Miriam and the children around the kitchen table and laid out a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. "We're going to get married tomorrow," he announced. "Not next month or after the court case is settled. Tomorrow. And we're going to invite Judge Harrison to witness the ceremony." Miriam stared at him. "Can we do that? Is there time to arrange everything?" "Charlie Morrison is a licensed justice of the peace in addition to being postmaster," Jed explained. "He can perform the ceremony. And I've already sent word to Judge Harrison that we'd like him to visit our home on December 23rd to see for himself the kind of life the children are living here." "What if he refuses to come?" Timothy asked, his young face serious with worry. "Then we proceed anyway," Jed replied. "But I think he'll come. Judge Harrison is a thorough man, and he'll want to see the full picture before making a decision that affects 2 children's lives." The plan was ambitious and risky, but it offered something that legal arguments couldn't: the chance to show rather than tell what their family had become. If Judge Harrison could see Timothy and Sarah in their own home, surrounded by the love and stability they had found there, perhaps he could be convinced that some things mattered more than legal technicalities. That night, as Miriam sat by the fire working on what would be her wedding dress, a simple blue wool dress that she was altering with lace from an old petticoat, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been a conventional widow, struggling to support her children and maintain respectability in a society that had little patience for women without husbands. Now she was preparing to marry a mountain man she had known for only 3 months, planning a ceremony that might be their last desperate attempt to keep their family together. It should have felt rushed, forced, desperate. Instead, as she watched Jed teaching Timothy how to carve a wooden whistle while Sarah dozed against his shoulder, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The wedding ring on her finger caught the firelight, reflecting glints of silver. That reminded her of the mountain streams where Jed had found the metal and shaped it with his own hands. Like everything else in this new life, it was simple, honest, and built to last through whatever storms might come. Outside, snow began to fall again. The gentle, steady snow that promised a white Christmas, but threatened to make travel difficult for anyone trying to reach their remote cabin. For once, Miriam found herself hoping that the mountain weather would cooperate with their plans rather than working against them. Tomorrow would bring their wedding day, and with it, either the beginning of their life together as a legally recognized family or the last few hours before everything they had built was torn apart by forces beyond their control. But tonight, in the warm circle of firelight, with the children safe and the man she was learning to love beside her, Miriam allowed herself to believe that love might, in fact, be enough to overcome anything. Christmas Eve morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles across the snow-covered mountains. Miriam woke before sunrise, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of anticipation and terror. That had nothing to do with the wedding dress hanging carefully from a peg near the window. Today would determine everything, whether they would become a family in the eyes of the law, or whether Timothy and Sarah would be taken away to live with people who saw them as obligations rather than blessings. The irony wasn't lost on her that Christmas Eve, a day traditionally associated with miracles and new beginnings, would either mark the start of their life together or the end of everything they had built. She had spent the early morning hours working on a special project, a quilt made from scraps of fabric that represented their journey together. Pieces of her old dress from the day they arrived, cut from one of Yet's work shirts that had torn beyond repair, fabric from the children's outgrown clothes, even a square cut from the buffalo hide that had served as Sarah's first bed in the cabin. Each piece told part of their story, and together they formed something beautiful and whole from what had once been separate and broken. "It's beautiful, Mama," Sarah whispered, running her small fingers over the carefully stitched patterns. "It looks like our family." The child's simple observation brought tears to Miriam's eyes. Yes, she thought, that's exactly what it was, separate pieces that had been woven together into something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have been alone. By mid-morning, the first visitors began arriving. Charlie Morrison came first, carrying his official justice of the peace credentials and wearing his best suit despite the challenging ride of the mountain trail. Behind him rode Dr. Milliken and Mrs. Henderson from the general store, both of whom had volunteered to serve as witnesses and character references if needed. But it was the arrival of the fourth rider that made Miriam's heart nearly stop. Judge Harrison sat his horse with the easy competence of a man who had been riding mountain trails longer than most people had been alive. His weathered face was impassive as he dismounted and approached the cabin, giving no indication of whether his presence was a good sign or merely a formality before taking the children away. "Mrs. Dawes," he said with a polite nod. "Mr. Cain, I understand there's to be a wedding today." "Yes, sir," Jed replied, his voice steady despite the tension that radiated from every line of his body. "We'd be honored if you'd witness the ceremony." Judge Harrison's keen eyes swept over the cabin, taking in the warm light spilling from the windows, the smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney, the obvious signs of a well-maintained home. "Before we proceed with any celebrations, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Mrs. Evangeline Hartwell arrived in Bear Creek yesterday with a court order from the territorial capital. She's demanding immediate custody of the children." The words hit like a physical blow, and Miriam felt her knees go weak. "Immediate?" "She claims that every day the children remain in this irregular situation is damaging to their moral development." The judge continued. "She's prepared to take them back to Denver today if necessary." Timothy stepped forward, his young face pale but determined. In his hand, He clutched the broken tin soldier that had been his constant companion, but now he held it differently, not as a security blanket, but as a symbol of strength. "Judge Harrison, sir, may I say something?" The judge looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course, son." "My papa, my real papa, he was a good man, and he loved us," Timothy began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But he was sick when he made that will, and he was scared about what would happen to us. He didn't know about Mr. Jed, and he didn't know that Mama could take care of us just fine on her own." The boy looked around at the faces watching him, his mother's tear-streaked cheeks, Jed's proud but worried expression. Sarah pressed close against Miriam's side. "Mr. Jed isn't trying to replace my papa," Timothy continued. "He's not trying to make us forget where we came from or who we were before we came here. But he loves us like we're his own children, and he takes better care of us than anyone ever has. And Mama, she's not the same scared lady who knocked on this door 3 months ago. She's strong now and happy, and she makes the best molasses cookies in the whole world." A ghost of a smile crossed Judge Harrison's stern features at this last assertion, but he remained silent, waiting for the boy to finish. "If you take us away from here, you'll be breaking up our family," Timothy concluded. "Not the family we were born into, but the family we chose to become. And that seems wrong, even if the law says it's right." The clearing fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant sound of snow falling from overladen branches. Judge Harrison studied the boy's face for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Sarah, who was watching the proceedings with wide, serious eyes. "And you, young lady?" he asked gently. "Do you have anything to add to your brother's testimony?" Sarah nodded solemnly and stepped forward, her small hand reaching up to take Timothy's. "I want to stay with my family," she said simply. "All of my family." Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he considered the children's words. Around them, the mountain silence seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. "Mrs. Dawes," the judge said finally, "may I see this home that the children speak of so fondly?" Miriam nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to trust her voice. She led the small group inside, where the warmth and light of the cabin seemed to embrace them all. The judge's trained eyes took in every detail: the well-stocked shelves, the children's school books neatly arranged on the table, the evidence of careful maintenance and loving attention that marked a true home rather than mere shelter. On the kitchen table sat something that made Judge Harrison pause: a simple drawing Sarah had made showing 4 stick figures standing in front of a cabin. Above the drawing, in Timothy's careful handwriting, were the words, "Our family." It was the kind of innocent artwork that might be found in any loving home, but here it served as silent testimony to the bonds that had formed in this remote mountain sanctuary. "Mr. Cain," the judge said, turning to face Jed directly, "what can you offer these children that their legal guardian cannot?" It was the question Jed had been preparing for, but faced with the moment of truth, he found himself setting aside all the carefully rehearsed arguments about financial stability and moral character. Instead, he spoke from the heart. "I can offer them a father who will love them not because law or duty requires it, but because they've become part of who I am," Jed said simply. "I can offer them a home where they're wanted rather than tolerated, where their questions are welcomed and their dreams are encouraged. I can't promise them wealth or social standing, but I can promise them they'll never doubt that they belong somewhere." He paused, his gaze moving to encompass Miriam and the children. "Most importantly, I can offer them the chance to stay together as a family, rather than being separated from the mother who's already sacrificed everything to keep them safe." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, then walked to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered landscape. "Mrs. Hartwell painted a very different picture when she spoke to me yesterday. She spoke of moral irregularities, of children being exposed to inappropriate influences, of a widow making poor choices that endangered her children's futures. "Mrs. Hartwell has never lived through a winter with no money and no options," Miriam said quietly, finding her voice at last. "She's never had to choose between her pride and her children's welfare. She's never had to discover that sometimes the most unconventional choices lead to the most unexpected blessings." At that moment, Charlie Morrison stepped forward, clearing his throat diplomatically. "Your Honor, if I may, I've brought something that might interest you." He withdrew a folded document from his coat pocket. "It's an affidavit from Dr. Patterson. In Denver, he was Thomas Dawes' physician during his final illness. According to his records, Mr. Dawes was heavily medicated with laudanum during the period when he supposedly signed that will. Dr. Patterson questions whether Mr. Dawes was in a proper state of mind to make such important legal decisions." The revelation sent a shock through the gathered group. If Thomas had been under the influence of medication when he signed the custody provisions, the entire legal foundation of Samuel Hartwell's claim could be called into question. "Furthermore," Charlie continued, "I've been doing some investigating into Mr. Samuel Hartwell's financial situation. It appears he owes substantial debts to several creditors in Denver, and gaining control of the children's inheritance would conveniently solve his immediate financial problems." Judge Harrison accepted the document and read it carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each line. When he finished, he looked up at the expectant faces surrounding him. "These are serious allegations," he said. "If proven true, they would certainly cast doubt on the validity of Mr. Dawes' will. However, legal proceedings take time, and Mrs. Hartwell's court order requires immediate action." Miriam felt her heart sink, but before despair could take hold, Jed stepped forward with quiet determination. "Then let's give you immediate action," he said. "Charlie, are you prepared to perform a marriage ceremony right now?" Charlie nodded, pulling out his official credentials. "I am indeed." Jed turned to Judge Harrison with something approaching a challenge in his eyes. "Your Honor, you have the authority to witness a legal marriage. If Mrs. Dawes becomes my wife today, in front of you and these other witnesses, then the question of moral irregularities becomes moot. The children would be living in a properly constituted household with both a mother and a father to care for them. And if the court eventually rules that the original custody provisions were invalid," Dr. Milliken added, "then the children would already be established in a stable, loving home where they've clearly thrived." Judge Harrison looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the obvious signs of love and care. The children's bright, healthy faces, the way they instinctively moved closer to both Jed and Miriam when uncertainty threatened. Finally, his stern expression softened into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Very well," he said. "I believe I would like to witness this wedding. And afterward, I think I'll need to have a very serious conversation with Mrs. Hartwell about the difference between a child's legal interests and their best interests." 6 months later, on the first warm day of June, Jed stood outside his cabin, their cabin now, watching Timothy teach Sarah how to cast a fishing line into the stream that ran through their meadow. The boy had grown 3 inches over the winter and had developed the kind of confidence that came from being valued and heard. Sarah, now 8, had blossomed into a chatterbox who treated the mountain wildlife as her personal friends and could identify every wildflower within a day's walk of their home. The wedding ceremony on Christmas Eve had been brief but meaningful, conducted in the warm glow of the cabin's firelight, with Judge Harrison serving as both witness and unofficial blessing on their union. Mrs. Hartwell had arrived the next morning in a fury, but faced with a legally married couple, supportive testimony from respected community members, and mounting evidence about the questionable circumstances of Thomas's will, she had been forced to retreat. The legal proceedings that followed had vindicated their faith in doing what was right rather than what was merely lawful. Dr. Patterson's testimony about Thomas's medicated state, combined with Samuel Hartwell's obvious financial motives, had been enough to invalidate the custody provisions of the will. More importantly, Judge Harrison's report to the territorial authorities had painted such a positive picture of the children's life with Jed and Miriam that no further legal challenges had materialized. Now, as Jed watched his family, and they were truly his family now, in every sense that mattered, he reflected on how much had changed since that snowy evening when desperate knocking had interrupted his solitary life. The cabin bore the unmistakable marks of feminine influence. Curtains at the windows, flowers in mason jars on the table, rugs covering the rough wooden floors. But it was more than cosmetic changes that had transformed his bachelor quarters into a home. The greatest change was in himself. 20 years of careful self-sufficiency had given way to the complex interdependence of family life. He worried now about more than just his own survival. Every decision was filtered through the lens of what was best for Miriam, Timothy, and Sarah. It was a responsibility that might have felt burdensome to the man who had first climbed this mountain seeking solitude, but to the man he had become, it felt like the greatest privilege of his life. "Papa Jed," Sarah called from the streambank, using the name that had evolved naturally over the winter months. "I caught one. I caught a fish." Jed hurried over to admire her prize, a small trout that gleamed silver in the afternoon sunlight. "That's a beauty, sweetheart. Big enough for supper if we can catch a couple more." Timothy beamed with pride at his successful teaching, and Jed felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he realized how completely these children had claimed his heart. The broken toy soldier that had once been Timothy's constant companion now sat on a shelf in the boys' corner of the loft, retired in favor of the real adventures and responsibilities that came with mountain life. From the cabin came the sound of humming Miriam's voice floating through the open door as she worked on her latest project. She had been commissioned by several families in Bear Creek to make quilts, her reputation for beautiful work having spread through word of mouth. The income wasn't substantial, but it provided her with a sense of independence and accomplishment that complemented her role as wife and mother. As if summoned by his thoughts, Miriam appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "How's the fishing expedition progressing?" she called. "Sarah's caught supper," Timothy announced proudly. "And I think there's a big one under that log that Papa Jed might be able to coax out." Jed smiled at the easy confidence in the boy's voice. Timothy had taken naturally to mountain life, developing the patience and observational skills that made him an excellent fishing companion. More importantly, he had grown into the role of protective older brother with a maturity that made Jed proud while sometimes making him wish the boy could simply be a child without worries. That evening, as they shared Sarah's fish along with fresh bread and early vegetables from Miriam's garden, Jed reached for something he had been saving for this perfect moment. From his pocket, he withdrew a wooden sign that he had been carving during the long winter evenings, a simple piece of pine with carefully burned letters that read, "The Cain family." "I thought it was time we made things official," he said, his voice carrying both pride and humility. "If you approve, I'd like to hang this by the trail where it branches off to our cabin." Miriam's eyes filled with tears as she traced the burned letters with one finger. "The Cain family," she repeated softly. "Yes, I think that's exactly right." Later, after the children were asleep and the dishes were cleaned and put away, Jed and Miriam sat on their front porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain air. The new sign sat propped against the cabin wall, ready to be installed in the morning as a declaration to the world that this place, these people, belong together. "Do you ever regret it?" Miriam asked quietly. "Giving up your solitary life for all this chaos and responsibility?" Jed considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he had been before that snowy November evening when everything changed. That man had been self-sufficient, predictable, safe. He had also been slowly dying inside, though he hadn't realized it at the time. "The only thing I regret," he said finally, "is that it took me 20 years to understand that the best things in life are worth the risk of losing them. I spent so long protecting myself from disappointment that I almost missed out on joy entirely." Miriam leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm in the cooling mountain air. "Thomas used to say that love wasn't about finding someone you could live with, but finding someone you couldn't live without." "Smart man," Jed replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I'd add that sometimes the person you can't live without finds you when you least expect it, carrying exactly what you didn't know you needed." As the night deepened around them and the sounds of their mountain home settled into peaceful quiet, Jed reflected on the truth that had taken him most of his life to learn, that the deepest loneliness came not from being alone, but from believing you were meant to stay that way. And sometimes, just sometimes, fate conspired to prove that belief wrong in the most beautiful way possible.